Our next speaker in this session is Professor Gerd Antes from Cochrane in Germany. Gerd Antes is a medical statistician, an honorary professor at the Medical Center, University of Freiburg, and director of Cochrane, Germany. Gerd is also co-founder and board member of the German Network for Evidence-Based Medicine, and also a member of the advisory committee for the Joanna Briggs Institute. Since November 2002, he's been a member of Guidelines Commission, AWMF. After several years as scientific advisory board of the International Clinical Trial Registry platform of the WHO, he became project coordinator of the German Registry for Clinical Trials in 2007. In 2012, he received an honorary professorship from the medical faculty of the University of Freiburg. Gerd's focus has been on global knowledge exchange and local implementation, and on improving knowledge translation for better practical use. Recent activities and publications focus on transparency issues in medical research and the ethical side of the right of patients to receive comprehensive information. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gerd Antes.
Thank you very much for the honor to, first of all, to be here. It's a bit far away from Freiburg in Germany. And second, also to speak to you at this 20th anniversary. I'm going more or less to draw the bigger picture directly connected to what you just heard and take you on a journey. Before, of course, I have to declare my conflict of interest. I think there's nothing really serious in connection with this talk, so I leave it with that. And I take you on a journey on the evidence production and dissemination, systematic reviews, of course, in the kernel of the whole technology, and in the end, and that links to my question I just posed, data linkage, open access, and big data, which are, I call them enemies. I will show you in a minute why. First of all, we always, as soon as we discussing these things, are jumping into the middle of discussions about trials, studies, quality, RCTs versus observational. But sometimes it's much more helpful to go back. Why are we doing all this? And we're doing it because we want to provide the best information to this poor patient. I call him Neumann. Yeah, and we need this information, and the problem is where do we get it from? And in principle, it could be from anywhere. Currently, we would think globally. So it could be any patients in the world who are treated or diagnosed under the same condition. And it's purely economically and rationally because it's simpler. The whole thing is organized in trials. But there are different ways to do that. For example, you could go for case control studies and pick similar patients and then pick controls. So there are similar ways, but the simplest way and also the way with the highest internal validity is with parallel, if possible, randomized trials. And that's one argument why they are so highly ranked. And if you go now into the world and have a look around, then you see how far this has grown. So this is a recent meeting, which is more or less the preparation for next year's meeting in Cape Town. And the big question overall is what works? And I'm now going backwards from this overall overarching question, what works, into more details. If you look around, you see a broad range. I will come back to this book, for example, which is the foundation of systematic reviews in the United States. But the question what works goes from very serious books to non-serious books in alternative medicine, for example. So the question is there everywhere. I will also come back to this a bit later. You see this learning what works, and this is from 2011 from the National Academy in the United States. You see at the bottom here, there you find all expressions which were already mentioned earlier in the talk before, registries, systematic reviews. I will come back to these issues later. To look at the big picture, the world is unfortunately divided into two parts. Evidence production, generation on one side, and usage on the other side. And what we see here is a big red line. In the US, this is sometimes still called this diffusion process. It's totally ununderstandable. And this question mark could be really much, much bigger. we know there's enormous progress crossing this border, but we very often don't know how. And that means if we want to influence it, we are very helpless sometimes, which is the best way to do it. Unfortunately, what we know very well is that 50% of what is started as trials or studies is never arriving where it should, users, but it's disappearing somewhere. I will come back to that point later. That's the body of evidence. And one reason why I show this slide is we have to accept that changes take time. I think it took me decades to understand it, to accept that what seems to be reasonable will not happen today. Yes, there are so many difficulties, obstacles to change that we have to accept it takes decades. It's always going in decades. And you see here that the beginning of the whole development was in '68 in the McMaster University in Canada, Cochrane almost the same time. Germany was much, much later, and if I would add Austria, that was 2010. So we are really in an early stage of what has been changed, although this change here has been 20 years already in the JBI. Who knows where the Cochrane Colloquium 1996 was? The answer is very simple. Adelaide. Yeah. And I was here, that was my second colloquium, but I have never heard JBI at that time. Yeah. So there was this parallel development in very early days, and I don't know whether you talked to each other at that time, and then the Cochrane Center was moved to Melbourne several years later. But the beginning, the birth was in this place, and so that's maybe deserves an applaud. So going a little bit into details, the trial deluge, we have heard a lot of problems linked to single trials. If you look at the development of trials, this is RCTs in Medline. You see the overall number, 490,000. This is not clear, it's totally unclear how many trials are described by these reports. So you see the number now. Now we have an increase per year of almost 30,000, but we don't know how much of these reports are really covering different trials. And the record number I know from a Cochrane person is, for one trial, 82 publications. And that means we have absolutely no clue where the truth is in this whole range. The truth is even worse. I said that 50% will never see the public. And so I drew this line above it, and that means that's the truth. And now this would not be a problem if this were selected randomly. But unfortunately, I mentioned there are about 30 studies which prove that this 50% is more or less working like a natural law. We did it here in Freiburg with our own ethics board. We checked all ethics approvals from 3 years, 10 years later, and 48% were published. So even at our own doorstep, we are not able to improve the situation substantially. There would not be a problem if it would be random, but of course it's not. What we just heard, I completely agree with the previous presenter. What we see is what we like, and what we don't see is what we don't like, of course. I mean, this is human nature. I would do the same. And we heard already that the word cheating may be used here. I would repeat that. There's a very conservative estimate of how many patients are cheated because the information they contribute to their trial is not arriving at the public. And probably it's 5 million or more per year. So that's a very serious ethical problem. And the bigger problem is that nobody cares. And if you look at the big problem, the bigger picture again, and then you see the old evidence-based medicine, as Dave Sackett invented it, is practically more or less useless. It's a good model for workshops to understand the principle, but in practice, currently, these 3 columns have been established worldwide. So that's HTA for coverage by health insurances, clinical guidelines for healthcare, patients, hospitals, and patient information. And then it goes on here. And the current system is that the information is disseminated globally and received globally, but the implementation has to happen locally, and that's one of the big challenges. You see the red line again. And if you, sorry, I have to emphasize this, the big problem is here, systematic reviews are the bottleneck all information has to go through. The big problem is that the start of the whole process is systematically wrong. That's what I've just shown you. So you should start on an unbiased level, then go into the lower levels. But this here arrives at the systematic reviews by publication bias and by misreporting is seriously biased. So you start on something like this, which is a real problem, and you can't do anything against it currently, except you change it in a principal way, as what we just heard. And the impact of this, I think, is not accidentally. It's always psychiatry which is involved if there's something goes wrong. You see here that the overestimation of antidepressive drugs in this very readable paper is between 20 and 50%. So, and that's more than slightly wrong. It's a very, very serious bias with very, very serious impact. Let's have a brief look at what the Canadians call the knowledge refinery. JBI, in their manual, they have a much more complex way to describe systematic reviews. But if you boil it down to a very simple version, then in principle, it's 5 steps. It's starting with a PICO question, searching, critical appraisal, summarizing, interpreting, and implementation. And this book, for example, describes it in English and German. This is currently translated into Chinese, so it's still not outdated. If you look at, this is probably the most shown forest plot, at least I know. I'm not going into details. I want to emphasize a few things here. First of all, the enormous length of time people do trials addressing the same question. Second, the enormous variety and heterogeneity in trial size. You see here, that's 23. Then you see so-called mega trials here, adding up to 36 patients. You see an enormous heterogeneity, and that's the meta-analysis. So that's a weighted mean of these single trials. 2 things to emphasize. How is it possible that somebody passes an ethics board with a trial of less than 100 patients after 36,000 patients have already been included? So I think this person needs a reward. But the same question applies to this mega trial. Why do you need a trial of 17,000 patients if you have already 20,000? The picture becomes much clearer if you look at this way. So that's the same data displayed in a cumulative way. And then you see here, this is more or less looked at it as one trial jumping with every single trial. And then you see here that the situation somewhere here is more or less clear, and then using common sense, you would say, why don't you stop here? And that's the question in this article. You see here, New England Journal of Medicine, already 1992, and the argument here was when the confidence interval is not touching the neutral line anymore, then you should stop somewhere here. This argument is statistically wrong because it's a repeated test and you do it after you finish the whole thing. So theoretically it's very complex, but in principle it's very simple. You should stop. And if you should stop here, then the serious consequences that the rest below that is unethical, because an unnecessary trial is unethical. And again, I have to state that nobody cares, especially not ethics boards. Yeah? They just continue the same process, although this is very clear. It has been written up very often. And we have to accept that even now, 2016, there's no accepted stopping rule. There's no logistics to do it, and there's no theoretical framework when to stop. And that's a real challenge, which is more or less, the other side of the problem we heard in the first talk. It's just the same story from looking from top on it. And that's why this is more or less a helpless concept to ask for all trials. We know we don't get them anyway, but it's more or less, let's try to get as much as we get to be on the safe side as far as possible. But we know while we are doing it that it doesn't work. And this is another example showing it more explicitly. This is from The Lancet, and this is really readable, this article in Clinical Trials. Again, the time is from 87 to 2002. Approximately after 5 years, you should have enough. And what they did here is that it went through all citation lists, and then the really striking result was that at any point here, looking backwards into the cumulative knowledge was more or less a very short time window, and the rest was simply forgotten. So it looks like a collective loss of memory, something like that. Yeah, and this goes over the whole timeline. That means, again, very serious ethical concerns, but also a huge waste. Why are you rambling on all the time? So, and again, the ultimate aim is, because we don't know how to do it better, to try to get all trials. And in principle, and that's the base for systematic reviews, and in principle, academically, this has been, and politically, more or less closed, the discussion in 2011 by the final discussion in the Institute of Medicine with that book I showed in the beginning. And this now is feeding back into the system. You see National Library of Medicine, PubMed, what works? Yeah, clinical effectiveness. So it's there. It's all over the place. But nobody really considers the deficits at the start. And that's, I think, simply amazing, because we know what we do, and we more or less repeat serious mistakes and go into maybe wrong directions, although we could try to change the whole system. And this is what you know, for example, if you start with the first search, you may end up with thousands of hits. You miss all this here. You may miss this because you don't find it. And then you go into the quality process, and then you may end up in systematic reviews, maybe 20, 30, or even less trials, which are really above a certain quality measure. And if you look at the high-end journals, we already heard some complaints about the New England Journal of Medicine, for example. The Lancet is always one of the driving forces, although also they sometimes misbehave. You see here, 1st of January 2015, they introduced this box that every report of a clinical trial has to start with the current knowledge. That means with a systematic review. This is from the author instructions, but it's also the instruction for reviewers. So in principle, if you report a trial and don't start with the current state of knowledge, you will get it sent back immediately, and you usually do. But that's only the Lancet. So they also say here, health research at the same time. Authority in the UK now states, any project should build on a review of current knowledge. Same statement, so start with the knowledge. But, as we heard before, and that's why I repeat to that point, we can't really start with the current knowledge because we don't know 50% of it, and what we see is heavily biased. And if you go back to that point, usually we emphasize hiding whole trials. But what has become more and more obvious over the last years is that hiding information of the trial and also moving away from the protocol and coming out with something completely different, as we had just heard the description, because it is nicer to see, is probably the bigger problem than hiding whole trials, because hiding whole trials is in principle, it's fairly simple to repair. And one reason why registers have become popular in some sense over the last years is because with them, making all trials public is in principle possible and could happen in principle tomorrow. It's not happening. You see here, that's the WHO network, and there's one portal where you should be able to see with one visit what is going on ongoing trials in the world. So this is, I just included the Australian, New Zealand register here. That's a European register only for drugs. That's a big problem. That's a German. So they are called primary registers. That's clinicaltrials.gov. They are, for political reasons, not a primary register. And the whole system is in principle well designed, but it doesn't work completely as we would like it to work. And one serious reason is understaffing in WHO. Yeah, it's heavily understaffed. Most people think this is only to police pharmaceutical industry. What you see here is that's the Australian register. It's also to inform the public, to allow recruiting patients in your neighborhood, and to build the culture. And I think that's one of the crucial steps. If we really want knowledge generation and translation, then we have to increase this process. And third, it's also to avoid waste. The typical situation is that you have a few trials and you start with a systematic review. And I would say currently you should look at a register to see whether there's a super trial just running parallel to you. And if that happens, don't start with a systematic review. Just postpone it, because the results of the big trial will override everything else you had so far. It's a waste. Yeah, is trial registration playing the role it should? Currently it's not. So registration rates are fairly low. There are no sanctions, and if there are sanctions, like in the US, they are not applied. And the conditions worldwide are very inconsistent. We have lots of methodological papers, what we also heard in the previous talk, which investigate. So this is what the part, the 50% we don't see. So trials which show adverse events are not published at all, but also in trials which are published, they are not shown. And that's one quick view on the legal situation. The US, because of very serious problems with suicides among children, they have a law for both sides. So the future is to have publications in the register without text. So also what was suggested in the previous talk, only have the numbers published in the register. But if you see here, this was 2011, 2014. I was twice in Parliament for hearings here, and on the last day before the law came out, this was simply forgotten. Ask me why. And the same thing in Switzerland 3 years later, they had in the law registration, but they forgot publication. And if you go around the world, conditions are just inconsistent, and so the WHO system can't really work reliably, which is even more surprising. If you look at the Declaration of Helsinki, the latest version, you see that 35 and 36 of paragraphs, registration and publication are very clearly requested, but without legal power and without political power. The name, we didn't speak about our two talks, so I'm glad that I mentioned GSK here, and I wasn't sure whether I should say that in a positive way or negative way, but now I know I should criticize it. Yeah, see here, there's Ben Goldacre, nowadays very famous. This is, I think it's both. It's moving forward, so GSK, it's a clear signal that GSK cannot ignore this activity. In that sense, I think it's positive, but I think it's not positive in the sense that we should now trust them and think that all the things we have heard before are forgotten and will not happen again. They will happen again. Cochrane is just involved in most of these things, and the leading principle, and I'm an absolutely fan of this, is the risk of bias, so very rigid methodology as a base of the whole procedures. Output of Cochrane is not only the Cochrane library, I would sometimes even say it's more important on the methodological side. And you see here, for example, there are 15,000 methodological articles collected in that part. This is now archived because even Cochrane is not able to fund it anymore. You see the impact factor, which was mentioned in the discussion about JBI in the library here. And you also see this incredible difference between what I showed you before from Medline and Cochrane. These are trials. So if you take, say, 150,000 away because they're duplicates or they are wrongly classified, then it's still double the number I've shown you before from Medline. So in principle, you should go there and try to find trials there. This is the growth of the Cochrane library, and it's, I call it, approximately linear. And now I come back to the point which was also mentioned in the previous talk. What we see now here is more or less an explosion of systematic reviews with an increase per year of approximately 8,000. And Cochrane is not really relevant anymore. So from private communication, I know that if you take all gray areas together, you may go up here to 11,000, and then Cochrane is below 10% in the production of systematic reviews. So they are not anymore a leading player. And the reason is that the acceleration of systematic reviews has a very destructive impact. And this has been described by the paper which has been mentioned before, John Ioannidis, and it's called The Mass Production of Redundant, Misleading, and Conflicted Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. And I would say this paper is a must reading, yeah, because it's really relevant. And the reason is very simple. Our whole system of incentives is wrong. Yeah? Everybody is chasing for impact factors. I've written it up here. So the system is wrong. Our agendas are driven by science and scientists, and they get their incentives from impact factors. And scientists, the real scientist, is not really interested in patients. It sounds very, very, very bad, but I've been living in this world now for 35 years, and I'm absolutely convinced that this is right. It's career-driven, and it's maldevelopment of journals also. And that's, for example, described here. We tried to have another register for systematic reviews, Prospero, but if you look at the numbers, what is the register there? It's even more or less satisfactory than for trials. And one reason, and this is usually not completely understood, even by people who think a lot about it, is open access and data sharing. If you look at this, they are called predatory publishers, and this is 2014. These are journals which more or less appear out of nothing and offer publications if you pay. And you see here the number, the increasing number of these new journals from 18 to 923 so far in this year. And the rule behind it is that financing the publication process is completely shifted from buying the products to paying for writing. So if you write it down in a cynical way, then you see here in the past the poor couldn't read, and now the poor can't write. Yeah? And costs go up in biology if there's a lot of graphical stuff, up to maybe more than $4,000 or $5,000. So that's a business model for new journals, and now we have 2 or 3 new journals every day. And of course, because the volume is expanded so much, quality has to go down, because we don't keep the same number of high-quality authors to serve the double number of journals. It's impossible. So that's a very typical consequence. And if you look at the map where this happens, don't be surprised. So this is India. This is where it happens. Then it's Nigeria, and the money goes to the US. You find all these things very simply on the internet. So this is not from the last year. And if you then look, for example, at Nature, they ask for stop these journals, predatory journals, and then you see here these recommendations. The problem is that even the so-called high-quality journals, they show a certain range of misbehavior. So there's no strict border that you can say, well, these are the bad guys and these are the good guys. We have heard several examples already about the New England Journal of Medicine, but there's a complete range from lends it, I would say, to criminals nowadays. Yeah? And they have absolutely no interest to get anything of this piece here right. And in the middle, there's a large gray area, and that makes it so difficult to find that solution for that. And what, for example, Nature now did, and this will also fail, they will introduce 2017 that if you have an article, that you have to make your data available. But nobody offers a structure. So you have to throw your data just somewhere in the internet, and then the poor customer who wants to work with the data has to invent a system how to work with them. It doesn't work. Okay, language, I got the first warning. Very simple. The whole world we have discussing here so far is in English. The problem is implementation has to be in local language, and currently there's absolutely no solution to systematically get it down here. This is what we've done in Germany and many other countries, difficult to read. We have language summaries of systematic reviews, and we translate them. And this is the curve. So in German, that's about 100 million people in Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. We have now, of these 6,000 or 7,000 systematic reviews, 1,000 translations. That's the growth. And we are hoping to complete that very soon. The biggest challenge, and this came out also, all this what I described happens this summer, is to get this updated. Because if you update this on the primary level, and all the rest of the chain, especially translations, have to be changed as soon as possible, which is almost impossible to do it or to get it done soon. So that's another unsolved problem. And now, the biggest competitor currently is big data. Can I get 5 minutes extra? 2. Okay. There's no clear definition, velocity, volume, variety, and the dream is to have machine-driven analysis of data, complete access to all data. Yeah, I've described it here in bullet points. That means you have to more or less give up privacy of data. We already spoke about these limitations. I've written that up in a paper which is called here A New Science Ability. It's really striking and scaring. There's no theory by definition. There's promises that it will work just by expectation. There's no validation if you go through these papers. Basic rules of good scientific practice are more or less abolished, and I would say it's a clash of cultures what JBI has done, what Cochrane is doing, what has done, and this new forces coming out of the blue. And it's a business model in principle of Google and Amazon. If you come back to this loop between patients in research and patients who benefit, then in principle, you have this seriously flawed literacy system. You have individual patient databases, synthesis, which, if we go to that step, means that the output of systematic reviews will be seriously reduced. So I was on the steering group at that time, and we made the decision for more or less economic and effectiveness reasons to stick with the literature. And there are strong voices now who say, and this happened a few weeks ago, the European Medical Agency opened the data for analysis, that we should go directly there. The limitation is obvious, it's only drugs. And second, it will take enormous effort, and the output will be reduced maybe down to 10%. The promise from big data is data drilling, Dr. Watson, deep learning system, yeah? So it looks more or less like a business program for medical informatics or bioinformatics than for science. And what you see here is all pictures before showed the arrow coming down, so you start and then go prospectively. Here, the whole system is retrospectively. You're just digging in the existing data. this is the second last slide. Why is this so difficult? There's a broad reluctance. Transparency is painful and hurts. And this is, and I completely disagree with the notion that it is always industry. I could give you plenty of examples that academia is not better at all. Yeah? Being transparent, for example, with a register, that the whole nation can see that in a particular university there's not a single clinical trial, is painful. And so the dean will try to hide it somehow. And I can give you these examples. I can give you examples of clinicians who deliberately do not publish. Is the glass half full or half empty? I would say it is half full. It's very different in different countries. We need quality improvement on all levels. We need the right trials. We need them in a better way. We need less trials, clearly. We have to bring the whole system together, and if I had to reduce my whole talk into one word, then this word would be quality. We need rigorous methodology, and I think in that sense, I would like to congratulate JBI because they are one of the strong forces to go for quality in opposition to many other forces to try to stop us on the way to truth. So congratulations and thank you very much.